Thanks so much, Lockie. Thank you for that too. There is an outline to follow, which you would have been given on the way in. If that's useful for you and it helps you to keep up with things, use it. If you'd rather just listen, that's fine too, I understand. A not yet Christian friend of mine in his late 20s resonated when I showed him the flyer of this event we've got coming up, the work of a restoring. He's recently immigrated from Brazil with his wife. And he said, "You've got no idea what a massive change it was for us to make that trip from Brazil to here. We shifted halfway around the world for a better life. And when I got here, I just worked and worked and worked myself silly because I knew everything was riding on my decision, on that decision that we'd made to leave one part of the world and come to this." And he said he worked so hard and for so long that in the end he burnt out. And then he had to accept that his strategy of just working and working and working wasn't actually working for him. I listened to him and I thought, I'd never ever considered how much pressure is on a new immigrant coming to this country to make a fist of it and to get those visas in place. I'd never thought that they were so susceptible to overwork. Now, have you considered the great point of difference for Christians when it comes to their reason for working? Their purpose in work, but also why they rest. Why do we need to think in a biblical and godly way about rest? Because work and rest come up for every human being at some point. They are the great themes of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. God secures rest, as we heard in Hebrews, for those who turn to him. The Old Testament will teach you that God's people, they were given the Sabbath as their delight. And it was designed for them after they'd worked their guts out as slaves in Egypt with no break, no rest. And it was to be a constant reminder to them that they were free. And they weren't to go back to that world of enslavement. Yet by the time you get to the New Testament, the Pharisees are just whipping the people's backs with the Sabbath. As technology gives us great capacity, we do more and more and more. And that also affects us in the church and how much good ministry we think we can do. Dr. Peter Adam is an Australian preacher, theologian, he's a mentor, he's a writer, and after 40 years of helping ministers, he made this uncomfortable observation about current church culture. He said, "We may love God deeply, we just don't know how to sit quietly with him anymore." As a parent, you know one of the greatest legacies you can pass on to your children through your faith is teaching and modelling to them how to rest in God. So we're going to look at this subject of rest now. I ride this journey occasionally on my way home from the city where I work. And occasionally I take this scenic route through the West Terrace Cemetery. I know that sounds very strange, but the first thing you notice when you take that ride is the hush that comes over peak hour. You cycle past the graves of people who, from a brief glance at the headstones I've seen, you realise that some of them have worked very hard throughout their life. Some of them had their dreams cut short. Some loved passionately. Others were barely tolerated. Some worried about a lot of stuff. Others expected that life might have given them more. But what they've all got in common is that the dust of their corporate lives have settled in that place. And a constant refrain that reflects their collective hope on the gravestones is rest in peace. Rest in peace. It's a sobering 5-minute detour. I do it regularly because I know one day I will join them. One day I have to join them. The topic of rest is so relevant, and I'm appealing to you today to grapple with what it means for you to rest in peace. To do that, we're going to do a few things. We're going to have a look at how Jesus secured rest at the cross. Then we're going to think about how being a Christian is a type of resting throughout your whole life. Resting on someone else's work. Then we'll look at what can threaten that rest. And then the great warning not to neglect the rest that we read in Hebrews, and the irony of how we have to struggle to hold on to that rest throughout our lives this side of paradise. Okay, so rest assured. If you go through the Gospels, you will see that Jesus juggled work and rest. In Matthew chapter 4, you see his humanity there where he sleeps in the bottom of a boat in the middle of a storm because he's exhausted. You see his teaching on rest in Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest." And then he proclaims himself the Lord of rest in Matthew 12. And that last claim really gets up the nose of the Pharisees. And from there they go and plot his death in John 5. If you really want to understand what sort of rest Jesus was talking about when he said he's the Lord of rest, it culminates in what goes on at the cross. How does dying on a cross make Jesus Lord of rest? If you read the accounts of the crucifixion, as we just did, you'll notice there's a lot of writhing, there's a lot of loud calling out. This is no peaceful, no quiet moment, no slipping away in a hospital ward going on here. Jesus is restless. Why? Well, I'm thankful to Tim Keller for this insight from Isaiah chapter 57, verse 20. And here's what it states. "The wicked are like a tossing sea, which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud." There's no peace for the wicked. The wicked are restless. So there's Jesus on the cross. He takes on all the wickedness, all our sin, all our restlessness. And in his writhing, he is experiencing infinite restlessness, cosmic restlessness, restlessness for the whole of humanity and the whole of history. Why? Because he's securing our rest. He goes through turmoil, and then he says, "It's finished." No more doing, no more wrestling. Here's an intriguing way for you to describe yourself as a Christian next time someone asks you what you are. You could say, "I rest not on my works, but on someone else's. I rest on the utterly perfect and finished work of Christ. God accepts me, not because of my record, but because of his. And so I'm rest assured." Rest is something that's been secured outside of myself. Wow. In contrast, the wider culture is struggling to understand rest. One of the great dangers of technology, more recently COVID, is the acceptance of working from home, and we've got bills going up in Parliament to try and deal with that at the moment. But what's happened is work and rest have been sort of pressed together in this strange sort of confection, and we never quite leave work when we're at home, and work is sort of ground down to this fine powder that's sort of peppered through everything that we're doing, wherever we are. There's no boundaries and there's no definitive breaks. Now, in that environment, we as Christians need to recalibrate our mindset about rest. There are two options, I think. You can either be a thermostat where you set the temperature on something like rest, or you can be a thermometer that just reflects the wider culture of restlessness, where our medal of honour is longer days, busier work hours and overpacked diaries and chronic tiredness and burnout. In the book, Why You Get More Done When You Rest, it's not a Christian book, but Alex Pang, his research says, far better results come from the people who rest. Pragmatically, deliberate rest will give you sharper ideas, greater reflection, more creativity, and better health. Without rest, there's no chance to think about where you're going in life, what your purpose is, and where you want to be. Now, I know this principle, and you probably do too. I know this principle from my buddy at the gym, who, if we're doing a combination of exercises, he times the rest before we do it again. If we don't do that, the exercise becomes increasingly ineffective. For those of you who enjoy your veggie patch, you probably know that you just can't keep pumping the soil to give you everything every year. You have to let it lie fallow sometimes, or put a green manure crop in to renew the soil. For those of you who love your food, you know that when you bring the roast out of the oven, it's really important to just let it rest so the juices are contained within it. We know this principle in life, and yet at the same time, we think we can live without night and day. We can live without the seasons and the rhythm of the week, and we can push ourselves, and the whole thing becomes a constant twilight. Kevin DeYoung, in his book, Crazy Busy, he points out that we get 2.5 hours less sleep on average per person now than our counterparts in the 1920s. We're all living on 2.5 hours less sleep than the people who lived 100 years ago. Theologian Don Carson lists sleep deprivation as one of the 6 possible causes of doubt in God. So, if you're not really going well in your relationship with God, maybe you better go and have a good night's sleep. Psalm 127:2 warns us. It says, "In vain you rise up early and go to bed late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves." When you go to sleep, in effect, you down tools and you say, "I'm not God. I can't keep the world spinning. I'll leave it in the hands of the one who can." So more than struggling, the world is actively trying to erode that rest that Jesus won for us. And the book of Hebrews in the New Testament depicts the Christian life as this big, long journey that we're going on, with a goal at the end of reaching God's rest. And if you would like to, you can look up Hebrews 4, verses 1 to 11. Just read through that, glance through that now on your phone or in the Bible you've got there, because it draws some great parallels here to, I think, where we're at as a culture. The Old Testament people of God, they were rescued from slavery, they were led out of Egypt, and they were taken to a place of rest. That was the promise to them. It was a dangerous journey through a wilderness, and what happened on the way was the people wavered in their trust. They weren't sure that God was going to give them a home and give them rest. And that prolonged their unhappy journey, and a whole generation died in the wilderness. Now, what's the point of the story for Christians who get this letter thousands of years later? Well, in a wave of hostility to this new fandangled thing called Christianity, some Christians thought it might be easier, because they were converted Jews, to retreat back under the umbrella of Judaism, because at least that was tolerated in the Roman Empire. It might temporarily take the blowtorch off them, but in the end it would be a complete denial of everything that Jesus had won for them at the cross. They would stop resting on the finished work of Jesus, and they'd start trusting and relying on their own efforts and their own achievements. And that sort of reversal was unthinkable for the pastor who wrote this letter to them. So Hebrews unpacks, I think, 3 key truths about rest that are worth noting. And they'll take you far beyond Israel and the wilderness in the Old Testament. The first is this: God's rest existed before the Jews were slaves and before they left Egypt. God's rest was a thing back in creation in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 4. The second thing is the rest remained after they got into the promised land. It still remains. That some will enter that rest, it says in verse 6. And thirdly, that rest is open to us today. Verses 9 and 11. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Now, Hebrews equates ultimate rest with entering God's kingdom in the future. Otherwise, they would have got it when Joshua led them into the land. The rest of completion that God proclaims at creation is what he's longing for Christians to enter completely when they reach heaven's gates. We experience it partially now. We have the Holy Spirit. He takes up residence in our lives, but we don't have the full box and dice of heaven now on earth. And that experience of the part holding us to the future rings true in our own experience. You know, you think about it, it's a thought of a holiday that can keep you going through a really, really stressful patch. It's the thought that the weekend's coming that will help you through a hell of a week at work. It's the hope of a ceasefire for those who are in a country raging with war. Delayed gratification. That's what Hebrews is trying to impress on us. The pursuit of eternal rest is costly. It's like a pilgrimage. It's a journey that you're taking, where the disciple at the end of their days will cease from their labour as God did from his in Genesis 2. Andrew Delbanco, in his book, The American Dream, this is a great quote to remember, I think. He says, "Hope is the way we overcome the lurking suspicion that all of our getting and spending amounts to fidgeting while we wait for death." Hope rises you above that, where you're just fidgeting while you wait for death. There is absolutely no question that God is holding out rest. So you need to hold on to that hope, because there's many human beings out there who are just fidgeting. How does that compare with your current picture of rest? Well, I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's a long hot bath, deep soaking bath for your tired muscles. Maybe it's kicking back under the veranda after you've mowed the lawns. Maybe it's curling up in front of a crackling fire. But whatever it is, you unconsciously equate it with eternity when you say, heaven. Heaven. Tim Keller describes this as our deep inner machinery wired in our DNA, constantly murmuring for eternity. That's what we're doing. God's picture of rest eclipses what we so often settle for, and which will never, ever deliver what we hope it might. C.S. Lewis captures the irony. He says, "We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered to us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea." We're far too easily pleased. Our bar is too low. The Bible is urging us to strive to rest. Hebrews' picture of rest is costly. Becoming more like Jesus is not just about, just making it over the line and collapsing. The word strive there in verse 11 is the word that's used to describe the intense concentration of energy necessary to reach a desired goal. It sort of commandeers everything in you. And it begs the question, over what sort of things have you done that in life? Maybe finishing a house, chasing a romance, ticking off the bucket list, trying to start a family, landing that job that will change everything. Well, it's striving for the inferior when something greater has been promised to you. How do you know if your drivenness is flawed? Here's a couple of questions. Do I check work emails and phone messages after I've knocked off? After I said I've knocked off? Do people preface their request to you by saying, look, I know you're a very busy person, so I don't want to trouble you? Do your family say, we don't really feel like we have you? If you've got young children, do you have any time in the world to pray for them and for their future? Do you have time to pray for yourself? Do you stop and eat together with other people at least once a day? I mean, life teaches us the dangers of neglecting rest. Shallow relationships, health risks, addictions. Hebrews is just taking the negative results of human beings failing to taking proper rest, physical rest, and then applies that brilliantly to a spiritual realm of rest, to warn us not to miss out on appropriating God's ultimate answer to our human restlessness. Verse 11, let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. The Christian life is a day-by-day, hour-by-hour proposition of trusting and resting. It's not just when you become a Christian. It goes on every day. You rest on those promises of God until he takes you home, as we heard Leon has this week. It's being captured by a vision and not allowing lesser things to airbrush that vision out for you in your life. It's choosing ultimate rest over this paucity of rest that's being offered in the world. Now, how can you secure that sort of rest? Well, first of all, tip number one, talk about this with other Christians. Brainstorm. How are you resting? How are you putting work in its place? How are you avoiding the distractions that can take your eyes off your future? How can I avoid being overwhelmed by what I have to do? That's a really important thing to do with other Christians. Start practicing real rest now. It's not enough for you to work like a demon and then... It means having fewer goals, maybe. Not trying to have it all and do it all. Maybe saying no to things. I've got a friend who, they're very, very gifted and they're always asked to do things at church and at work and other places. And what they say is they remember, they've said they can say no to people because they know they've said yes to someone else before. Something prior. Make yourself accountable if you've got a busy patch coming up in your life. I don't know, maybe you've got to start up your own business, or maybe you've got a new role in a workplace, or maybe there's a project you're trying to do and it's going to require overwork from you for the next 12 months, and you can't just have that nice balance in your life that you'd like to have. Well, say to someone you love and trust, when the time's up, come to me and stop me because I don't want to make going at that sort of pace normative in my life. It's just for a season. Build some unstructured time into your life. That's time that's unplanned, undiarised, just time where you give your body, soul and mind a chance to free will and things can actually have a chance to bubble to the top. I preached at a service where the Governor of South Australia came after she had been at the fires over on the Eyre Peninsula. It was horrific. There was a lot of, it was a long time ago, but a lot of death. She was sitting right down in front of me while I was preaching, and then she started to sob during the sermon. After the service, I was thinking, well, how do I raise this? But I gently asked her, what was it about the message I gave that triggered that? She looked at me confused. There's nothing about your message. It's just that's the first time I've had to stop and process what I've been through over the last few weeks. Unstructured time. There's an unhelpful drivenness in human beings to validate the space they occupy in the universe. Because what we're doing is we're saying, here's my justification for being here. And that's a wearing task. You'll never know whether you've done quite enough. And you'll be proving yourself to yourself and to the people you love and to the people who hate you. And surely at the end of the day, there's a better way that doesn't wear you down to the bone and re-enslave you. It's finished, says Jesus. Am I truly resting in what Jesus worked so hard to secure for me? The man who strove to build bigger barns to store his harvest. Hey, look at that story. What a work ethic. What insight. Jesus looks at it and says, what an idiot. Striving needs the right focus. Entering the rest that Jesus secures for us at the cross, if you want to appropriate that in your life, it requires persistence, focus, not slipping back into a flawed and inferior offering. As Christians, we need to be advocating rest to the people around us, Christian and otherwise, in our workplaces. We need to lead on rest. This is our big point of difference to the wellbeing movement. We rest for a different reason. And we rest because of someone else's work. Real rest will liberate you, and it will save you. A year ago, almost to the day, I helped a mate out down at Victor Harbour who needed to move a whole lot of stuff and had a bad back. And to thank me, he took me out very early in the morning to a place called Petrel Cove. I'm just giving any of the fishermen here some knowledge here. It's the right time of the year. Petrel Cove. First serious fish in my whole life. I didn't know what to do. But it was a pitch-perfect day. The sun was rising up across the water. There was enough warmth to be knee-deep to waist-deep in that cove. And I was learning how to cast the rod, and the fish were biting. So this is what happened. It just kept putting the bait on, and the fish came in. And I couldn't believe that I was doing this as a novice. The sun was dancing over the water, and as the crest of the waves would come up, you'd just see these schools of yellow-eyed mullet just sort of surfing the waves. It was so perfect. I remember unconsciously thanking God for this amazing creation, for providing food for me for breakfast like this. A magical moment captured in time. And if I could describe to you, if you're finding it hard to imagine what heaven would be like, that place and that moment, it's the closest I get to it. And to think that when we were scrabbling around in the dark, getting our gear together to go out, I had second thoughts about doing it. Man, I could have missed that. Maybe you need to do something yourself that reminds you where your rest is heading as a Christian. The closing pages of the Bible say this, Revelation 14:13. Blessed are those who die in the Lord, for they shall rest from their labours. The tension between work and rest, it gets resolved finally. And we'll kick back and we'll reflect on what has been done for us, and we'll join the chorus with God and say, this is good. This is so very good. Let's pray. Father, we pray that you would help us to secure the rest that has been secured for us. Help us to strive to enter the rest that you hold out to us. And may that be a beacon to the people around us who are working their guts out for nothing. Amen.